What do you do when the road ahead is impossible and the enemy behind you is unstoppable? What happens when the very God who called you forward seems to have led you into a trap? This is the story of Moses, Pharaoh, and the moment a sea became a doorway and a nation was born on the other side of the impossible. There is a moment in the life of every leader when the weight of everything crashes in at once, the crowd behind too large to turn back, the road ahead too dangerous to promise, and the enemy too close to ignore. Moses stood in exactly such a moment on the western shore of the Red Sea, with all of Israel at his back and the dust of Pharaoh's chariots rising on the horizon. He had not chosen this road easily. He had not, in the beginning, chosen it at all. 40 years earlier, he had been a prince of Egypt, raised in the palace of the very Pharaoh, whose armies now bore down on his people. Then came the burning bush, the voice from the flame, the sandals removed on holy ground, and a commission he had argued against until he ran out of arguments. He had gone back to Egypt. He had stood before Pharaoh again and again. He had watched 10 plagues tear through the most powerful civilization on earth. The Nile turned to blood. The sun was blotted from the sky. And the final terrible night arrived the destroyer, moving through the streets of a weeping nation. And now, at last, Israel was free, or so it had seemed. Because freedom in the economy of the Exodus is not a single event. It is a process, and the process was far from finished. The sea lay ahead, the army lay behind, and between them stood a man with a staff, a people on the edge of panic, and a God who had not yet finished doing what he had promised. The story of Moses and the Red Sea, recorded in Exodus chapters 13 through 15, is arguably the defining moment of the entire Hebrew Bible, a story of terror and deliverance, of doubt and faith. It is the miracle that anchors Israel's understanding of who God is and what God does, a people who could not see the road ahead, and a God who split the waters to make one. The journey to the sea began, paradoxically, with God choosing the long way round. When Pharaoh finally released the Israelites after the death of the firstborn, there was a direct northern road to Canaan, the coastal highway the Egyptians called the Way of Horus, well-traveled and lined with military fortresses. But God deliberately avoided that route. As the text records, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter, for God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. The reason given is remarkable in its honesty. God was not protecting Israel from a physical obstacle. He was protecting them from themselves. 400 years of slavery had produced a people who knew how to survive under a taskmaster, but had never learned how to hold ground when resistance came. If they met armed soldiers on that northern road, the gravitational pull of the familiar, even the familiar of chains, might simply prove too strong. God understood the condition of the people he had just set free, and he chose the route that their formation required, not the route that their calendar preferred. 400 years of slavery had taught Israel how to endure, to survive, to keep their heads down under the taskmaster's rod. What they did not yet know was how to fight or how to trust a future they had never been allowed to imagine. The long road through the wilderness was not an obstacle to their formation. It was the formation itself, and they were not traveling alone. The text describes what guided them with magnificent simplicity. By day the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. This pillar cloud by day, fire by night, communicated something profound. Their God was not tied to a temple or a territory. The wilderness, the sea, the in-between spaces were his jurisdiction too. He was a traveling God, and he traveled with them. Moses also carried the bones of Joseph as they left Egypt, honoring a deathbed oath made 4 centuries earlier. It is a detail that illuminates something essential. The Exodus is not only a journey into freedom, but into memory, into identity. into the long faithfulness of a God who keeps his promises across generations. Now, the divine instruction at the opening of Exodus chapter 14 does not read like the strategy of a general trying to win. God tells Moses to turn the people back toward the sea, to encamp near Pi Hahiroth, between Migdol and the water, opposite Baal Zephon in ancient geography. This placed the Israelites in an apparent dead end, sea before them, desert on either flank, open road at their backs. From every human military perspective, this looked like a catastrophic blunder, but God's stated purpose is extraordinary in its candor. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. This is not merely a rescue strategy. It is theological theater, a confrontation engineered at a place where two cosmologies would meet and only one could survive. Egypt was not merely a political empire. Pharaoh was, in Egyptian cosmology, a god himself, the son of Ra, the incarnation of Horus, the living guarantor of divine order that held the universe together. The 10 plagues had already assaulted this theology systematically. Now the sea would become the final instrument through which the god of a slave people would publicly refute the claims of the most sophisticated civilization the ancient world had produced. Back in Egypt, grief was giving way to something colder and more dangerous. When the king of Egypt was told the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds entirely. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." 600 of the finest chariots in Egypt were assembled, officers over every one, and Pharaoh himself rode at the head of the greatest military machine the ancient world had ever seen. They rode out with certainty. From every rational standpoint, the outcome was not in doubt. When the Israelites looked up and saw what was coming toward them, they reacted exactly as people do when confronted with evidence of their own powerlessness. They reached for the nearest available object of blame. For a people trapped on the shore of an uncrossable sea with an army at their backs, that object was Moses. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. The bitterness is almost tangible across the millennia. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt? A sarcasm so savage it carries a kind of desperate wit. Egypt was, after all, the civilization that had made an art form of burial. But there is something psychologically honest in their complaint that goes even deeper. They said they would rather return to slavery than die in freedom. Slavery had the terrible advantage of being known. It had structure, predictability, a certain logic. Freedom, when it first arrives, does not always feel like freedom. Sometimes it feels like exposure, like standing in the open with nothing between you and the sky. And into that moment of maximum fear, Moses spoke one of the most compressed and theologically precise speeches in the entire Hebrew Bible. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Do not be afraid. Stand firm. Be still. 3 commands, each harder than the last, when the ground is shaking with the hoofbeats of 600 war chariots. The theology embedded in Moses' words is precise and deliberate. The deliverance is not something Israel will achieve. It is something they will see, done for them while they watch. You need only to be still. Then God's own word arrived, and it was not further comfort. It was command. Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea, to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. Why are you crying out to me? A question that has troubled commentators ever since, because the text has not reported Moses crying out. Perhaps it was internal, a prayer without words. Perhaps the question is less a rebuke than a signal. The time for prayer is giving way to the time for action. The staff must be raised, the hand must stretch out. The moment has arrived. But before Moses raised his staff, something quieter and less spectacular than the parting of a sea took place. Something that would protect an entire nation through the longest night they had ever known. The pillar of cloud that had been leading Israel southward through the desert moved. It withdrew from its position at the front and repositioned itself behind them, placing itself between the camp of Israel and the advancing Egyptian army. The text describes the effect with precision. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. The same cloud, the same divine presence. But depending on which side of it you stood, it produced opposite effects: light for those it sheltered, confusion and darkness for those who came against them. One cloud, two experiences, differentiated entirely by one's relationship to the presence of God. All through that night, the cloud held its position. All through that night, the work was already underway at the water's edge. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. A wall of water on their right and on their left. The Hebrew word for wall here is the same word used for city ramparts, the defensive structure that encloses and protects the people within. The sea, representing chaos and death in ancient Near Eastern cosmology, has been forced into the shape of a fortification. What threatened to swallow them is now holding back the thing that threatened to re-enslave them, and the ground is dry. Not muddy, not treacherous. Dry. This is not meteorological coincidence. It is the reorganization of the natural order by its creator in service of a covenant that existed before the world was made. The Israelites crossed through. The text gives us the fact and leaves us the experience, the sound of the wind, the strange silence of water, held vertical by a power none of them could name or measure, the wet smell of the deep sea, hundreds of thousands of people walking on ground that had been the floor of the ocean an hour before, the cries of children, the bellowing of cattle, the creak of cart wheels on salt-crusted sand. Whatever they said to each other in that corridor between the walls of water, the text does not tell us. It gives us the crossing and moves on. Then all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. It is one of the most psychologically revealing moments in the entire narrative. The commanders of the most powerful army on earth, watching a sea stand, vertically drove into the gap anyway. The logic of pursuit is sometimes stronger than the evidence of one's own eyes. Pride does not stop when the evidence turns against it. Pharaoh had watched 10 plagues roll through his kingdom without surrendering his fundamental conviction that he was the most powerful force in the world. But something began to change during the last watch of the night. God looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. Chariot wheels jammed. The vehicles became almost impossible to steer. And the soldiers of the most lavishly equipped military force in the ancient world said to each other in a corridor between walls of water something remarkable. "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." They had understood, too late, and with the water beginning to move, but they had understood. God told Moses to stretch out his hand. At daybreak, the sea went back to its place. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. Not one of them survived. The bodies were thrown onto the shore. The Israelites stood and saw the faces of the men who had driven them into the brickfields. They were dead. Every one of them. The power that had held Israel for 400 years had been broken in a single morning. The text records the response with the precision of an eyewitness. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord, displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Fear and trust, not contradictory, but inseparable. They had seen what this God could do, and that seeing became the foundation of their faith. Fragile and wavering as that faith would prove to be in the months ahead, but real. They had seen it. They could not unsee it. Then Moses and the Israelites sang. The Song of the Sea in Exodus 15 is among the oldest poetry in the Hebrew Bible. Many scholars believe it was composed very close to the event itself. It is a song of pure, unalloyed praise, the kind that pours from people who have experienced something so far beyond expectation that they have no adequate response except music. It is also, notably, a song in which Moses himself does not appear. The whole of it is directed to God, and it is God alone who fills it. I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He has become my salvation. The language implies process, an arrival, a rescue that came entirely from outside the capacity of its recipients. A gift rather than a transaction. Then the song asks the question the entire Exodus has been building toward. Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? In the ancient Near East, the relative power of gods was demonstrated by the fortunes of the nations that served them. And when Egypt's gods failed and Israel's God prevailed, it was not merely political reversal, it was a theological declaration. Among all the powers invoked by all the nations, none is like this one. The song had already understood what would take the world centuries more to begin to grasp. Then Miriam, Moses' older sister, the woman who had watched from the bulrushes as a baby was floated down the Nile, took a timbrel in her hand. All the women of Israel followed her with timbrels and dancing, and Miriam sang to them. Sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea. The women danced on the shore of the sea that had just swallowed the army of the world. Not warriors celebrating military conquest, but women dancing in the morning light with timbrels in their hands. Joy does not always arrive in the forms that power or dignity would choose, but it arrived, completely, undeniably, on that shore. But the story does not end on the shore. Exodus 15:22 notes, with characteristic swiftness, that Moses led Israel away from the Red Sea into the desert of Shur, where for 3 days they found no water. When they did find water at Marah after 3 days, it was bitter and undrinkable. And the people who had danced with timbrels were within 72 hours grumbling against Moses. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Within 72 hours of the greatest miracle in their history, they were grumbling again. This is not a contradiction of everything that had just happened. It is simply the truth of human nature, and the biblical text is honest enough not to idealize it. The faith produced by the miracle of the Red Sea was real, but not yet deep, genuine but not yet durable, like a plant that has broken the surface but has not yet driven its roots far enough down to withstand a dry season. The crossing was the beginning of a formation that would require 40 years, not 40 days, 40 years. But the Red Sea crossing remained, throughout all of Israel's subsequent history, the irreducible bedrock of their faith, the miracle they returned to when everything else was uncertain. In Psalm 136, the psalmist surveys the sweep of God's faithfulness and returns after every act to the same refrain. His love endures forever, and there in the middle of the psalm the waters appear. To him who divided the Red Sea asunder, his love endures forever, and brought Israel through the midst of it, his love endures forever, but swept Pharaoh and his army into the Red Sea, his love endures forever. The great act is remembered not merely as a demonstration of power, but as an expression of love. The parting of the sea is, in Israel's theological memory, the most eloquent possible statement of what it looks like when the Creator of the universe decides that a particular people will not be abandoned. The Apostle Paul, writing in 1 Corinthians 10:1-2, would later reflect on the crossing as a kind of baptism, a passage through water that separated one life from another, the death of an old identity, and the emergence of a new one. Every person who has since passed through baptismal waters in the Christian tradition reenacts in some sense this crossing, leaving behind the old enslavement, emerging into a freedom purchased not by their own effort, but by a power not their own. Moses himself would never fully arrive at the destination toward which the crossing pointed. He would wander with his people for 40 years. He would intercede for them in their rebellions. He would strike a rock in anger and lose his right to enter the promised land. He would climb Mount Nebo and look out over Canaan from the far side of the Jordan and die there, in the wilderness, buried by God himself. And to this day, Deuteronomy 34:6 tells us, no one knows where his grave is. The man who parted the Red Sea has no monument, no identifiable tomb, no earthly memorial. He is simply the servant of God, known and remembered entirely through what God did through him. But on the morning of the crossing, none of that was yet known. There was only the sea behind them, flat and still in the dawn light, and the bodies of the Egyptians on the shore, and the great open desert ahead. And the pillar of cloud was already beginning its slow movement toward the horizon, marking the way forward. Behind it, the people of God, burdened, exhausted, elated, frightened, free, following it into whatever came next. It is the oldest journey in the world, and consider this, your life right now may be standing at its own Red Sea water ahead, enemy behind, and no visible way through. The story of Moses and the Red Sea does not promise you a life without impossible moments. It promises you something far more useful, that the God who made the water can move it. What does it mean for you today that the Lord who said, "Stand firm," to a terrified people on the shore of an impossible sea, is the same Lord who says it to you? Is it harder to trust when you can see no way forward, or harder still to trust when you have seen or foreseen the miracle and still find yourself grumbling 3 days later? The story is honest about both, and it waits for your answer.